Well, of course, I went to Tempe, which was called a normal school. It was established statewide in order to train the teachers they needed. You know, they needed teachers all over. Arizona was still a territory, and they needed teachers very badly, and they were establishing school districts everywhere, and so they gave you special teachers training, which was equivalent to your high school years. You know, by the time they gave you 5 years of training, and you were a qualified grammar school teacher because they concentrated on, you know, teaching methods and everything. And there was a training school where you got experience and took your education courses and psychology courses and all that. So you were most of the education you got was just how to plan your lessons, how to present your subject matter, and it was just real teachers training. So the first year after I was graduated and had taught a year, I went to Flagstaff to summer school. Before that, we had taken a trip for the summer up into the mountains, and Grandpa Shuley had bought a cattle ranch that was in Strawberry Valley, which was just 5 miles over the divide from Pine, Arizona, which was just a small town. But Strawberry Valley was just a string of ranches, maybe 5 or 6 ranchers in the village, and most of them had some cattle, some horses, and some little pasture land where they raised some alfalfa, baled some hay and things like that, tied them through the winter. So it was sort of self-sufficient. We had chickens, we had a adorable garden, and we had the only windmill in the valley. We had the nicest well, and we had a windmill that pumped the water. So people used to come to our house constantly to get the drinking water. I will.
You're talking about school.
I will. So every summer, that used to go into the mountains until after I was teaching school year. Then I went to Flagstaff to summer school. They had also a normal school in Flagstaff, and Flagstaff was such a revelation to me. I'd never seen that part of Arizona, and it happened to be a good year for snow, and there was plenty of snow on the peaks. And of course, the first thing we did was to rent horses and go up to the snow area. And boy, when you come off the desert and climb those San Francisco peaks and just start rolling and tumbling and snowballing and everything, and all of a sudden I felt like somebody was hammering me on my throat, on each side of my throat, just like I was being hammered. And I sat down, and they said, "Watch it. This is altitude affecting." But we had such a marvelous time, and that whole summer was just one great big picnic. It was really delightful because we were taken to the Grand Canyon, to the Sunset Crater, Wupati, and we'd climb up and down those canyons, and Oak Creek, and wade in the creek. You know, it was the most heavenly summer. We went in a surrey with a fringe on top, the horses, and this is the way we went on the picnics, all of them. Well, after that summer, there was this whole group of not only Babbitt, but there were about 3 boys to one girl in Flagstaff, and you were just surrounded for dates and places to go and things to do, and you were really treated royally. It was just a wonderful summer. After that, Joe Babbitt started coming down to Phoenix to have his dental work done, and I was teaching school down there. And this was the year that they went into the automobile business. They started up a Ford business, and so his brother David had a Ford agency in Phoenix, so Joe could come down to Phoenix and always get a car, you know, to come over to Mesa. And it was an old dirt road and check holes, and he used to swear at the blackbirds. You know, those trees the trees were just big cottonwood trees, just full of blackbirds, and so they were all making fun of him all the time. They really were a nuisance in the whole valley. Well, how I first met Daddy, the way we took a train to Flagstaff up through Prescott and Flagstaff, and the train was it was just a day coach, of course, but the train was just full of students arriving, you know, to Flagstaff. And when we arrived at the depot, and began single file to come out of the train, here was an ocean of boys, and there must have been 30, 40 young men down there standing in a crowd, and we were so amazed, and we thought, well, what's going on? What is it? And they weren't cowboys, or they, you know, were just, you know, they looked like students, young men, nice-looking young men, but this whole group of them. And they seemed to be anticipating, I thought maybe there was a celebrity on board or something. And shortly after we didn't know what was going on, but shortly after we got to the dormitory, we were called to the parlor, and the matron of the dormitory, there were 3 young men in the parlor, and she introduced them to us. They had picked us out as we descended down the steps of the train. They had picked us out, followed us to the dormitory, knew which dormitory we were in, went in, described us to the matron, and demanded an introduction. So that's how I met your father.
Summer, what a wonderful.
So after that beautiful summer, I went on teaching in Mesa, and then I moved down to the Alma School, where I was a kind of a general supervisor. I taught not only the first grade, but I taught music in the first, second, third, fourth grades. I taught the public school music.
Piano and
the sight singing and choral work. And even though I wasn't a singer, I still knew music. I played piano, you know, and I established a little rhythm band that was school. It really became famous. In fact, we had invitations to all the visiting schools in the valley to go and the little rhythm band to play. And yes, chimes, you know, the triangles, drums, tambourines, anything without pitch. And we had a little conductor, you know, one of the children to mark the time, and I would play the melody on the piano, and they would be the main orchestra, but I carried it. That was the only one that carried the melody.
young children?
They were the first graders. My little rhythm band was the only one in the valley, and of course they immediately established them and adopted the idea. Well, I went, the next year, after going to Flagstaff, the next year I went to Berkeley the next summer, and all those Babbitt boys, this was the year of 1915, was the World's Fair exposition in San Francisco, and of course San Francisco just across the bay from Berkeley. So this whole group of Flagstaff boys that had been so wonderful the year before, the summer before in Flagstaff, they all arrived in San Francisco to see the World's Fair, and they gave us the big whirl, and among other things we spent a weekend. Some of them had some friends in San Diego, and they invited us to their home. In fact, some of our boys had enlisted in the Army that year, and they were in uniform in 1915. They were taking training.
And this is where you had those little silhouettes down at the fair that year?
Yes. That's when those little silhouettes were made. You know how these artists sit at the fairs and draw your portrait or cut out these silhouettes.
Cut out with scissors?
Yeah. Well, and then the next year I went to Columbia University.
New York?
Yes. And on the way back, we swung down through Idaho, went to some friends that we had met in the Salt River Valley, some young men who were working there in reclamation work. Some of them lived in Idaho and in Utah, and we sort of kept up a little incidental correspondence. And anyway, one of the young men invited us to stay with his mother, and he took us through Yellowstone Park on a 3-day trip through Yellowstone Park, which certainly made a wonderful year because we had there was Edith Mullen and I. We had one other girl with us, but she didn't go to the Yellowstone. But Edith stayed and took the Yellowstone trip with us. But we had the whole year in Columbia University. I mean, the whole summer, Columbia University, where it was wonderful because we had access to all the theaters. We earned our own money for 2 or 3 years, you know, and saved it up for these things. So they were having summer grand opera and everything. We went to all the big theaters and would spend the weekend in Washington D.C. You know, and we spent. There were some people who sent us to their friends in Pittsburgh, in Pennsylvania. And it seemed like every weekend at Columbia University we had a one. But even Carl Hayden in Washington, D.C., Carl was Edith Mullen's neighbor in Tempe, and so he was wonderful to us. He gave us tickets to a big banquet at the Waldorf Hotel. Yes, and
now was Edith a relative? She was just a school friend, wasn't she? Just a year friend.
She was a friend since I can remember. The Mullens were our very good friends in Mesa. In fact, we had an organ at our house, but the Mullens had a grand piano. So I was taking music lessons on the organ, but I was allowed to go over to the Mullens and practice on their piano. That's where I first got interested in music. And then later they moved to Tempe. They bought a ranch right next to Carl Hayden's in Tempe. And my father had known Carl Hayden for many years anyway, and so we called on Carl in Washington, D.C., and it was wonderful. He gave us tickets to everything. We just, you know, saw the inside of Washington from one end to the other. And this Waldorf Astoria was a beautiful trip for us, and I'll never forget the dinner we had there that night. It was served in so many courses and everything, you know. We didn't care what it cost us, just the privilege of getting there. And I'll never forget what they called the Peacock Alley. Was this long corridor with full-length mirrors on each side, you know, that's where all the big social events were held, and the ladies in their grand dresses and tiaras, diamond tiaras, and all where they would strut, promenade. Social events.
You were teaching. This was a summer school at Columbia, and you were teaching in the fall.
This was summer school. Well, it happened. I took special music courses both at Berkeley. And I took special folk dancing, and you remember all the little old things I used to teach you, Mary? Well, I learned those at Berkeley and at Columbia University. At Columbia, the rhythm band was one thing that they were teaching the teachers, you know, how to handle it, and that's where I picked that up. Became very popular in the Salt River Valley.
Formal schooling in Columbia, wasn't it?
Yes, I didn't go to school after that until after I was married, and I was constantly in some class or other at our local college, which was a normal school then, and it was a college now. Of course, it's a big university. Yes, he used to come down every time he could get an excuse, and he'd come down to get his glasses fixed. He'd come down to get his for all his dental work, and any excuse to come down, and then he would always, we'd, have a date, go to the theater and things like that, or picnics on Sunday and that sort of thing. And he was, well, he first proposed is when they came to San Francisco from Clinton, Berkeley. That was only the next year after that, but I kept on teaching for a couple of years after that, and then I didn't make up my mind to get married until the thing that really put it over was when they joined the Army, and he was going off to go into officer training camp, and so everybody was getting married before their boys went to war. Same thing that happened to my daughters too. And so
he went to the camp.
So he was in he was in San Diego at no, Kearney wasn't the name of that, because Kearney was was back in Kentucky, I think, wasn't it? No, I guess Camp Kearney was in San Diego, Camp Kearney. But anyway, that's where Joe was. And then he signed up for officers training, and he was to be shipped back to Louisville, Kentucky.
Who was it you were?
Officers.
Any of your family?
Yes, my mother and father went over.
And where?
We were married. We were married at the Army base. Yes, in the Catholic chapel, the Army base in Kentucky. And Joe's father came, and Gertrude. Gertrude and Joe's.
Who was the best man?
Joe's father, and Edith was my bridesmaid. And Joe had an Army boy friend stand up with him. Right this minute, I can't tell you what his name was.
And then where'd you go? Did you go on a honeymoon?
And yes, we went up San Francisco. I think we just had 3 or 4 days or something like that. And then we took an apartment in San Diego. And I lived there, and Joe he'd only get to come in on weekends from the camp, but he could call me, at night and that sort of thing.
What did you do? Just nothing? You weren't?
I just kept house. I learned to cook, and I baked cakes, and we'd take them out to the Army camp. And I can remember making a banana cream cake once, and made this nice cream frosting, put fresh bananas, and they all began to slide off, and I had to stick toothpicks in each one of the sliced bananas, the whole of it. So the cake was all full of toothpicks, and I had to get those big long ones too, because it was more than one layer. But it was a good cake anyway. And there were several other people that I knew from home girls who, married soldiers, and they were also had apartments. We'd get together. Take these little kids, and we were learning to cook. One of the girls had a terrible accident. She had a pressure cooker in her apartment, and it exploded in her face and burned her eyes, and they were brand new. And they couldn't get an ambulance, they couldn't get a doctor, and the nurses in the hospital said, grate potatoes and keep them cool and keep packing. As they get hot, take them off and keep renewing it. And they said just put a solid pack of grated potatoes on there. And so there were 3 of us that we worked hours grating and changing, and those potatoes would just steam off there. Well, we saved her eyes, and her throat and face was all blistered, but
you were there for what? A few weeks or months?
Yeah, I was there about 6 months, I guess, and that's when I learned to drive a car in San Diego, because one of our wedding presents was a Buick, car, and
who gave it to you?
Ed Babbitt's, and
what did
I don't know, Joe's brothers, Ray and David, I guess, because Ed, Ed and the boys gave us the car, and Joe's father, then after we went back to Joe's father gave us the grand piano.
Where'd you get the clock?
The clock, we bought that with the house. It was left in the house that we bought. After living in one house for a while, and this was for sale where we lived for 55 years after that, and the clock was part of that household. Then Joe applied for officer's training, and he was sent to Louisville, Kentucky. And at first, I thought I wouldn't go back there, but the war just really steamed up, and we thought, well, by the time these boys graduated from officers training school, why, they'd be shipped overseas, you know, and
now this is
so
1917 or 18?
I think it was 1918 because I was teaching school 5 years
Okay.
altogether.
Now, you didn't go back to Louisville, though.
Yes, I did. I went back to Louisville, and fortunately, before the officers training course was finished, the war ended. I was in Louisville, Kentucky, for the big armistice celebration when the whole country went wild. And it was really a thrill to be in a big city then. Everybody loved everybody. It really was a night, I'll tell you. It was terrific. But Joe, you could come in. That was the year that the real bad influenza swept the country. And in this sort of family hotel, it was a hotel of small apartments where I lived. There was a house doctor, you know. And all he did, they didn't know what to do for this flu. But he had, yes, and when I got the flu, this doctor put me to bed and he said, you don't get up without my permission. You don't get up at all. And he gave me something to make me sweat. He said, don't you get out of those blankets wet. He says, if you get out, you take the blanket with you. And you stay in this bed until, and really, Mary, whatever he gave me made me sweat just like tea. You should have seen those sheets. They were just the color of tea and saturated.
How long were you sick?
And he had me sweating for about 3 days, day and night. And it cured me. It just threw that flu out, and I used that method of treating flu forever in raising your family. I used to give you children a teaspoon of sweet nitrate. It would make you sweat, and it's wonderful.
Daddy never had it, did he?
No, he didn't. He didn't get it.
Well, then, after the war ended and the armistice, you came back.
Well, the armistice was signed while he was. They just canceled out his officers' training. They canceled them all out, and we didn't know why at the time. We thought they were flunking out or something, and we couldn't imagine why, that they canceled out the officers' training division there, and Joe was in the medical corps. And we were terribly upset about it when we first got the word, and the next day we got the news about the armistice was signed. Yes, he signed up in the middle. I don't know. He had that's what he decided. That he would be interested in working in that.
So then, was he released right away?
And then, as soon as the armistice was signed, it was just a matter of them getting mustered out, you know. Well, Joe was he finally was released from Kentucky. Louisville, Kentucky. He finally was released, and he came home to Flagstaff for a little bit, and then he came down to the ranch and just stayed with me until Imogene was born. And dear Dr. Palmer, how faithful and wonderful that he was, and he didn't even bring a nurse with him. My mother, you know, helped him, and Joe as best he could. Anyway,
on the ranch.
Imogene was born on the Chandler Ranch in the wee hours of the morning, and by sunup, that amazing child, she was just a few hours old, and she just turned over on her pillow and gave us all a look with these wide open eyes. And she seemed to me she just practically sat up. They were so amazed that that absolutely newborn baby opened her eyes as much as to say, well, hello world, here I am, you better move over. Now, Imogene was such a brilliant baby that she, all the way through her youth and her growing up and going through school. She was an amazing student. There's so many incidents of her superior intellect, and it proved that she had a superior intellect. In fact, later when she was 3 years old and the psychology department at the university tested her, they gave her the rating of a genius, and it proved all through her education, all her life, this has been proven that they were absolutely right on her qualifications. She had it wasn't a photographic memory because she couldn't read, but if I would read her story 3 or 4 times through, she knew it word for word, page for page. You couldn't read her the story again and substitute one word for which you got checked up and corrected. She was really would go on a record as, you know, as an entertainer. I mean, she just never forgot things. She memorized them so thoroughly and so quickly that it was really remarkable. And she loved to have me read to her. Well, all the children did, for that matter. But she would climb up on the end of the drain board when I'd be cooking, and I'd have a cookbook propped up, you know, and she would say, "Read, read. Read, Mother, read." So I would have to read the recipes, add this, add that, you know. I'd have to read the recipes to her. So this business of adding was a very concrete thing to her. And one day, she and Betty Jo were wondering what they could play, and Grandpa Shuley had brought me a big box of oranges from the valley, and I handed him a basket of oranges, and I said, "Here, count the oranges." She was fascinated. She took the basket and took Betty in the other room. Pretty soon she came back to me with an accusing look, and she said to me, "I can't give Betty Jo half of them." And I said, "Well, how many oranges do you have?" And she said, "I have 11 oranges. I can't give Betty Jo half of them." And I said, "Well, Imogen, that's because this is an odd number." I said, "There are two kind of numbers, even numbers and odd numbers, and 11 is one of the odd numbers." She was fascinated by this, and we talked about 3, 5, 7, 11, and she tore back in the other room with Betty Jo, and pretty soon she came back. I can remember how she squinted her eyes down and looked at me, and she said, "I found out something. If you add 2 odd numbers together, you'll get an even number."
Better say that.
She was 3 years old, and she formulated an abstract quotation, an abstract formula, all by herself. And my first reaction was, "Gee whiz, is that true?" And this she discovered by herself. And that kind of mentality has always been her special gift. When I first sent her to school, I had taught her to read and write, and the poor sisters were astounded. They just didn't know what to do with her, because she could practically teach the class by the time she went to school, and they wanted to put